Good evening. I'm Donita Green, and I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the institutional approval process for human participants. Following that, I'd like to talk about how you choose a sample size, research instruments, and methods for outlining proper procedures for research. Institutional approval of research on human subjects. Whenever a research study is being planned using human participants, approval must be given by the Institutional Review Board, the IRB. The purpose of this board is to ensure that the research being planned causes no great physical and or psychological harm to the participants. Christensen et al. State that there are three levels of IRB review. First, there is exempt studies. Exempt studies appear to have no known economic, physiological, physical, or emotional risk to the participants. Most studies conducted by students, like ourselves, fall into this minimal category. The second category is called expedited review, and in this level, it is felt to cause no more than minimal risk to the participants. The review does not require the full institutional review board members during the consideration of this particular study. And finally, the third study or review is the full board review, and that is where the research involves more than minimal risk and requires the review of the entire board. Examples in this category are stressful psychological testing or experimental drugs. Human subjects. The National Institute of Health says that research falls under the umbrella of human subjects, even if you're not working on humans directly. 45 CFR Part 46, a regulation, defines a human subject as a living person whom a researcher obtains either data through interviewing or interacting with a person, or identifiable private information. That regulation goes on for the researcher to determine if his or her research is exempt. Once the researcher determines whether he or she will use human participants, the next step is to determine the criteria to be used. The researcher needs to determine whether the research requires men, women, children, or a particular group, etc. Participants can be sought from many sources if they meet the research criteria. College students are often used because they are readily available and because they often receive credit for participating in a particular study. The internet can be used, and the internet allows you to reach out to other countries, other cultures, etc. Or you can use a target group and reach out to populations where specific permissions are needed, such as a prisoner in the prison population, school-age children, handicapped persons, persons under psychological or psychiatric care, etc. Sample selection. Once you have determined what population to use for your research, a decision must be made as to how many participants are going to be needed to test your question or hypothesis. This is necessary to make inferences about a particular population. This is called a sample size. When looking at a sample size, you must also consider the effect size. Effect size is a way of quantifying the difference between two groups. Effect size emphasizes the size of difference rather than confounding the sample size. Research protocol and instrumentation. After determining the correct number of participants, the next step is for the researcher to determine how the dependent variable will be measured and how the independent variable will be presented. Personal computers can be used for presentation of stimulus material and for recording the dependent variables. A specific apparatus may be used to measure the dependent variable and the precise introduction of the independent variable. Our text gives the example of the dependent variable being a heart rate. A stethoscope can be used to count the number of beats per minute. Another example given in our text is the use of the measurement of brain waves to study the way brain systems respond to various stimulus conditions. And the book uses the example of words. And finally, Christensen et al. Suggests that the use of MRI scans, PET scans, and EEG recordings can show brain imaging and help to investigate the brain systems involved in many disorders and behavioral activities. The researcher must consider the study being conducted specifically and determine the best apparatus to use under that circumstance. A pilot study, which is an experiment that is conducted on a few participants prior to the actual collection of data, is often recommended. This study can look at whether the independent variable manipulation produces the intended effect. It also gives the researcher some practice. It is the opportunity to look at all aspects of the research and determine that things are effectively working. Finally, we've looked at this in previous chapters, but we must be cognizant of the need for written consent to participate. We must also consider carefully the instructions that must be written when using human participants in experimentation. These instructions need to be specific, but not too complex. Sometimes the instructions will be redundant, and that can be okay in trying to ensure that the instructions are clear and understandable. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me this evening, and I look forward to your comments.